how their mother stopped answering calls because heartbreak twice was too much. He said, "Sometimes I wonder why I keep trying to fix things that don't want fixing." I said quietly, "Maybe because you don't know how not to." He looked up sharply, like I had just echoed his own mind. Then, almost defensively, he said, "Yeah, guess none of us do." It was strange. We barely knew each other. But in that tiny shelter filled with rain and resignation, our words carried no performance, no filters. Just raw sentences, simple truths, the kind of honesty only strangers can sometimes afford. He looked at me then and asked, "What about you? You okay?" I almost said yes. But what came out was, "Honestly, I don't know." He nodded again. That's still an answer. The bus headlights appeared in the distance, a small flickering line of hope, approaching too slowly. We both sighed. Something about that approaching bus made every held breath escape at once. He said, "Sometimes I stand here just to remember the world moves even when I don't." I said, "That's poetic for a guy with groceries." He laughed again, this time louder. "Poetic's cheaper than therapy." That laugh did more than I can explain. It pulled something stubborn inside me away from bitterness, reminded me that humor exists even at the edge. Then he looked at me seriously and said stuff I'll never forget. "You know, I learned one thing about pain after my brother's first overdose. You can't carry it alone and expect to survive. It's like holding your breath underwater and pretending you can make it to the other side. Eventually, you have to inhale." I stayed quiet. He continued, "Whatever it is, whoever it's about, promise me you'll breathe tonight." I wanted to nod, but my throat closed up. So I stared at the wet ground, muttered, "I'll try." He said, "Trying's air enough for now." That line, it still lives somewhere in me. Trying's air enough for now. The bus finally pulled in, brakes hissing. He stood up, motioned me forward. "You first." I shook my head. "You were here before me." He smiled, small, knowing. "Exactly. You go." I got on, turned back once, just to wave something like thanks. But he had already stepped away, heading in the opposite direction, into the rain. I thought he'd catch the next bus. But when I looked through the back window, as we pulled away, he was gone, nowhere on the sidewalk, no sound of another bus arriving, just gone. I reached home soaked, clothes sticking, heart heavier, but somehow breathing differently. I took my phone out of habit, half expecting no messages again. But for the first time in weeks, it didn't sting, because suddenly someone had noticed me. Not because they were supposed to, but because they chose to. I sat in the dark for a long time, replaying that simple promise in my head. Trying's air enough for now. It didn't fix everything, but it stopped the free fall. It planted a reason to wake up one more morning. And that first morning turned into another, and another. Months passed. Spring came. The city looked softer again. I kept going back to that bus stop at different hours, half hoping, half dreading I'd see him again. I asked a few shopkeepers nearby if they knew a man by rough description. Mid-40s, carries groceries, kind eyes that look like they've seen worse, and still choose to stay gentle. No one recognized him. One older woman said, "Sounds like half the city. People carry groceries every day." Maybe he was nobody special. Maybe that's why it mattered more, because nobody special still cared enough to ask if I was okay. That summer, I joined a volunteer line that handed out food to the homeless downtown. At first, it was just to feel useful. But then I started noticing familiar faces. People invisible in plain sight. Sitting under awnings, waiting not for miracles, but for attention. And weirdly, I recognized myself in every one of them. Tired, hiding, pretending the rain is just weather. I started asking them basic things. Had dinner yet? Need a dry blanket? But sometimes all they wanted was a little conversation. A moment where their existence mattered. And every time someone's eyes softened for even a second, I thought of that stranger's tired smile at the bus stop, and how just seeing me had pulled me back to shore without him ever knowing. One night, almost a year later, I was finishing a food run when I saw a man sitting on a bench by the same bus shelter. Head down, dripping wet, phone off, everything about him screamed invisible pain. I walked up carefully, handed him a warm paper cup of soup, and said the first stupid thing that came to mind. "Did you miss your bus?" He looked up, startled, just like I had been that night. He said, "What?" "They're late tonight," I told him. "But they always come." He smiled weakly, and then, without realizing, I found myself saying something strangely familiar. "You know, you can't carry pain alone and expect to survive. Eventually, you have to breathe." He gave a short, almost choked laugh. "That's poetic for a guy with soup." I laughed too. Poetics cheaper than therapy. The exact same line. It felt like borrowed light passed down. We talked for 10 minutes. Nothing heavy. Before his bus arrived, I said, "Whatever it is, trying's air enough for now." He nodded. "Okay." Got on the bus. When the doors closed, I stood there watching the taillights vanish in drizzle and realized maybe that's how grace travels. One simple sentence at a time, from stranger to stranger. That night, walking home, I kept thinking how he probably had no idea what those words meant to me, and maybe he never would. Maybe that's perfect. Not every savior is meant to stay in your story. Some just stop by long enough to give you oxygen before fading back into their own storm. It made me wonder how many tiny rescues I'd missed in life. How many times someone smiled, held a door, said something careless but kind, and how each moment was a thread keeping someone from unraveling completely. We love dramatic rescues, sirens, headlines, fireworks. But the truth is quieter. Most lives are saved silently, in ordinary places, by people who don't even know they're saving anyone. 2 years later, I wrote a letter. Not to send, just to release. I started it with, "To the stranger who didn't know he was saving someone." I told him everything about that night, the way his words echoed, how I'd found new purpose, how I'd started helping people who needed the same listening ear I'd been given. When I finished, I folded it and left it tucked under the metal bench at that bus stop. No one would ever find it intentionally, but somehow I liked imagining another stranger sitting there someday, reading words meant for someone else, and realizing maybe it was for them too, because maybe that's what kindness really is. Not a transaction, but a chain reaction. Something soft that keeps going long after the person who started it disappears. When people ask me what changed my life, they expect a grand story, a big success, a bold decision, a miracle. But it wasn't any of those. It was a moment of being seen when I didn't believe I was visible anymore. That's the part I try to remember now every time I talk to anyone. The stranger serving coffee too slowly. The coworker staring too long at their desk. The friend who says, "I'm fine," too quickly. Because you really never know who's standing one step away from giving up. And sometimes one ordinary sentence is all it takes to pull them back. A look, a question, a laugh in the rain. Not every savior wears a halo. Some just listen. He didn't glow. He didn't preach. He didn't even know. But that stranger at the bus stop, he saved my life without ever asking for my story. And now, every time it rains, I hope I can be that for someone else. Be the stranger who cares. You'll never know whose life you rewrote.